Good morning. This morning's scripture reading is from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17. Grant did his best to edit the story of David and Goliath down to the most essential parts, which is why the verse selection looks so strange. The following is part 1, the author writes, and I suggest, having practiced this, that you visualize this. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistine, when David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistine and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the Israelites, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. The Israelites said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel." David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Here ends the first selection of the morning's readings. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
Alrighty, part 2 of David and Goliath. Here we go. The author writes, "When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, 'Let no one's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine.' Saul said to David, 'You are not able to go against this Philistine and to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth.' But David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God.' David said, 'The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine.' So Saul said to David, 'Go, and may the Lord be with you.' Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, 'I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them.' So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. Here ends this morning's reading from the book of 1 Samuel. Thanks be to God for these words of life. If you're a regular around here, you might be saying to yourself, wait a second, didn't Mike already preach on David and Goliath this summer? And the answer to your question is yes, he did. If you're a faithful reader of our weekly emails, you already know that Rob was originally slated to preach today. However, something unexpected came up at the last second, and when we realized he couldn't be present this morning, I was called in as maybe what you might call a last-minute pinch hitter. Hence the 2 sermons on David and Goliath. Plus, Mike's David and Goliath sermon, if you saw it, it was the first Sunday we were back gathered in the sanctuary in person, so the focus of the sermon was kind of more on that moment and less on the story itself. So we'll focus a bit more on the story as it stands. Also, you could ignore the YB in my sermon title. There's no significance, that's just a typo. So to start off, raise your hand if you are familiar with this story before this morning. The vast, vast, vast majority of us. Now raise your hand, not including Julie Moser's fantastic rendition in June. Now raise your hand if you've heard or read the actual text before this morning. Well, we got like 15, 20%, which is kind of funny, isn't it? I mean, David versus Goliath is probably one of the first stories we learned in Sunday school. And even if you didn't go to Sunday school, it's one of the most referenced biblical stories in the secular world. And yet, most of us aren't all that familiar with the primary source material. I gotta be honest, I love preaching on Sunday school classics. I had so much fun with Adam and Eve earlier this summer. I said it once and I'll say it again, Eve was framed. I stand by that. See, what I love about preaching on these stories is, as evident from our little poll this morning, many of us are introduced to these stories at a young age, and they can be really formative for us. But then as we grow older, we don't revisit them, which is kind of a shame. And honestly, I believe this is partially why some folks fall away from the faith as they enter high school or college or young adulthood. Because a Sunday school level understanding of these stories is wonderful when you're little. But those same ideas often don't hold up to complex adult level scrutiny. Noah in the ark, Jonah in the belly of the fish, Daniel in the lion's den. These stories were originally not written for children, but for adults. So when we keep our understanding of them at an elementary school level, we are doing both a disservice to the story itself, as well as our own mature understandings of our faith. So to begin, let's get that basic Sunday school understanding out on the table so we all have a common starting point. Generally speaking, this is viewed as the classic underdog story. We occasionally see it applied to court cases or politics, but overwhelmingly, it is applied to sports. 1990, Douglas knocks out Tyson. 2018, 16th seeded UMBC beats number 1 seed Virginia by 20 points, no less. The 1980 amateur U.S. Olympic hockey team. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that an against all odds story of war has been transposed onto our current athletic culture. And even for the Bible, the saga around David is particularly hyper-masculine. It features warriors and battle, and unfortunately, very few female characters. In fact, David's relationship to masculinity is actually a rather complex one, which we'll see manifest later in the story. Yeah, I know, right? It can be confusing, masculinity. So let's take a look at the story itself. We got the Israelites' army on one side of the valley and the Philistine army on the other, and Goliath walks out from among the ranks and challenges the Israelites' best warrior to a duel. How tall is Goliath? Well, there's actually some confusion here. The first century historian Josephus, and both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the fourth century Septuagint texts of Samuel, I hope you're taking notes, by the way, we're going to have a quiz at the end. Septuagint is spelled S-E-P. You don't need to remember that. But what you should note is that our oldest sources report Goliath as being 4 cubits and a span. How tall is that? LeBron James is 4 cubits and a span, 6'9". Now, don't get me wrong, if I'm standing on a battlefield and LeBron or any other 6'9" dude for that matter walks out and offers to fight to the death, I'm not exactly chomping at the bit to get out there. But in my opinion, that's not exactly like giant height, though. Now, to be fair, people in the ancient world were quite a bit shorter than we are today, so that height would be pretty imposing. But the guy on the cover of our worship order this morning is definitely taller than 6'9". However, this morning's reading from the Masoretic text, which our translation of the book of Samuel uses, lists Goliath at 6 cubits and a span. That's 9 feet 9 inches. That is legit giant height. I don't care where you're from, what time period you're talking about. That is a giant. And so how does this happen? How do we get this inconsistency? Yesterday, I got back from a vacation in northern Wisconsin with some of my childhood buddies, and the exact same thing actually happened while we were telling stories. It's a how big was the fish you caught situation. Like every time you tell that story, the fish gets a little bit bigger. As we were sitting around there around the campfire, I was reminded that we meaning adult men, have come a long way from dueling as a legitimate problem-solving strategy, but even after thousands of years, we are still stretching the truth on how big our opponent was, how fast we could run, how hard we could throw in high school, or whatever your preferred Goliath that you overcame back in the day was. But I digress. So Goliath comes out and offers this challenge. Now we know from chapter 9, as a friendly reminder, we are in chapter 17 for this morning's reading. But we know from chapter 9 that it is in fact Saul who might be the most qualified to go out there and fight. He's described in verse 2 as a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else. Head and shoulders above everyone else. Not 9'9", but as the biggest guy and the commander of the army, you'd think it would be his duty to go out there and fight. It's time to man up, Saul, to use a modern-day hyper-masculine phrase appropriate for this situation. But Saul doesn't. Instead, the focus of the story shifts to David. Now, David has already been anointed by Samuel as the next king of Israel, but outside of this, David doesn't really have any qualifications or special qualities that would make him deserving of such a title. His qualifications are literally from chapter 16, verse 12. He was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. That's it. David has the same qualifications as a Helmsworth. Except it is noted that David is shorter than all of his older brothers. So maybe like a 1986 Tom Cruise as Maverick in Top Gun situation. Additionally, David is described as skillful in playing the lyre, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. But this is word of mouth. He hasn't actually demonstrated any of this yet. So don't get me wrong, he's a good guy, but nothing super unique. So if David is going to be the future king of Israel, he's probably going to need to prove that he's got the chops for it. And here's where David's relationship to masculinity gets a bit more complex. He's the youngest of the brothers, so he's given the responsibility of tending to the sheep at home while his three oldest brothers fight on the front lines, which is probably already a bit of a chip on his shoulder. What gets the ball rolling is his father, Jesse, tells him to go and deliver food to his bigger, taller, and since they're serving in the military, ostensibly stronger, older brothers. This is many years before Rome and the appearance of large standing armies. So to me, it seems reasonable that the food supply for an army in a situation like this was not probably fully hammered out yet. So David shows up and hears about this Goliath. And I want to bring attention to the last line of June's reading. David says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Two things to note here. The first is that it is assumed that the Philistines are uncircumcised. The circumcision ritual was one that the Israelites took very seriously, with roots tracing all the way back to Abraham. And it set them apart from neighboring tribes. So to me, it is significant that David adds this already assumed modifier to Goliath. I believe it is because it has to do quite directly with how Israelite masculinity is understood. The Philistines are not manly in the way the Israelites are. In fact, they're simply wrong in their expression of manliness. So this battle, in certain ways, is quite explicitly about what sort of man is the manliest. The second point is that David characterizes the Israelite army as the army of the living God. To me, this is where secular interpretations of this story depart from the biblical intention. Yes, David is absolutely the underdog, but he isn't fighting for himself. In fact, David makes this fairly explicit in the back and forth he has with Goliath. I didn't read the second part of this story since it was pretty lengthy, but we hear David say, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. But this very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand." But, he continues, "And I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." That part was not covered in Sunday school for me, and I'm kind of upset about it because I probably would have been more interested in the lesson. A couple things to unpack there. First, the point I was making before about the difference between the secular and religious understandings of this story. The difference between UMBC in the NCAA bracket and David is that UMBC was playing for UMBC, while David is fighting as a representative of God. Perhaps the 1980 U.S. hockey team is more like David, in that the hockey match was essentially another battlefield for the Cold War, so they were fighting on behalf of America and capitalism as ideas. But an important distinction to make is that at least I don't believe that the U.S. hockey team was anointed by God in the way that David was. Some of you might disagree. I wasn't alive in 1980. A complicating factor to this underdog story, however, is how David is acting leading up to this engagement. As we heard earlier, he's practically bragging about his prowess with a sling in killing bears and lions while out with the sheep. And then, when he gets on the battlefield, he tells Goliath to his face that he's going to chop off his head and leave his dead friends out to be eaten by wild animals, instead of allowing them a proper burial. David, seemingly, does not believe that David is the underdog. Saul does. Saul thinks David is the underdog. That's why he first tells David David's not tough enough, and then loads David down with his armor, which of course doesn't fit because Saul is exceptionally tall and David is on the shorter side. David is a complex character. There are a lot of great things about David. He doesn't take credit for this victory, but attributes it to God. Later, Saul loses his mind and tries to kill David to maintain his own power, but David refuses to kill Saul because Saul was blessed by God, despite having multiple easy opportunities to do so. During his reign, David unites Israel, brings prosperity, and deeply loves God. I hear you, sister. Unfortunately, there are some pretty awful things about David, too. He rapes Bathsheba, then has her husband, who is also a close friend of his, killed in battle to cover up the resulting pregnancy. He caused the death of that child, bringing additional sorrow and trauma to Bathsheba. Later, one of his sons rapes one of his daughters, resulting in revenge killings and struggles for power. All this happens on his watch. And those stories all deserve their own sermons. I bring them up simply to show that David continues to struggle with his understanding of masculinity and his calling from God throughout his life. I would argue that God was certainly calling David to leadership, and that meant killing Goliath. But I don't think it also meant, after sinking the stone into Goliath's forehead, verses 50 and 51 read, "So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him. Then he cut off his head with it." Cutting off someone's head after they're already dead seems to me to be a bit more about being macho and a bit less about leading a group with God as your guide. He also keeps the head as a trophy, which is like a lot. God blesses David with immense power, but that does not mean that David is entitled to have sex with anyone he wants to. Many of us, and again, by us I mean men, feel the need to prove or demonstrate our masculinity in various ways. And this is by no means always a bad thing. David's understanding of masculinity pushes him out of his comfort zone and into being a strong leader. He develops a wonderful, profound, meaningful friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son, forged partially through the adversity experienced on the battlefield together. His responsibility grows from shepherding his father's animals to shepherding all of Israel. But we also see in David's case that a misunderstanding of masculinity can lead to disastrous consequences. Seeing those with less power as people to manipulate for our own selfish desires, arrogance in victory, attributing our success only to ourselves and not to others who helped make it so, the use of violence to resolve problems. Masculinity is complex. There's no doubt about that. It's been complex even in my own life. I've learned much about masculinity, as many of us do, from my father. Steve Glowiak was a talented and highly competitive golfer, and he fostered that play-to-win attitude in me. But he also showed me that the relationships with those whom you play the sport with matter more than being the winner. He demonstrated what it looked like to work hard and to provide for your family. Unfortunately, many mornings I would wake up early for school and he would have already left for work, arriving home hours after dinner, stressed and exhausted. that takes a toll on a mind and a body, as well as on the relationships that he had with his family. He taught me the meaning and value of resilience, toughness, and strength. But he was also a victim of his time, and like many men, buried his trauma. One of the most profound quotes I've ever heard, I think I've used it in a sermon before, is one from Richard Rohr, a prolific writer and Franciscan priest. He said, "If we do not transform our pain, we will always transmit it." And in my experience, as I'm sure it is in many of yours, whether intentionally or unintentionally, we often transmit that pain onto and into those whom we love the most. I still struggle where masculinity and meets anger, depression in my life, where self-confidence ends and arrogance begins. Am I arguing with someone because I want to change their mind, or simply to prove that I'm right, that I am smarter than they are? These are ongoing challenges, but despite those challenges, I am exceedingly grateful. I'm grateful because every morning that I wake up, God has given me another shot. God has blessed me with another day. Another day to be a bit more like the David who loves God, and a little bit less like the David who abuses his power. Another day to become a little bit more of the man I hope to be, and a little bit less like the boy that I was. It is for that daily opportunity to grow into the person that both God and I want and know that I can be. That opportunity to join in building God's kingdom of justice and mercy here on earth. For that, I am eternally grateful. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.